Good. All right, Ryan is here, so we can get started. Mia was taking care of you, Ryan. She said, "Don't start till Ryan gets here." All right. So anyway, I'm glad to see everybody here. My name is Bill Smedick. I direct the Leadership Studies program in the Whiting School of Engineering, and I'm a associate teaching professor here. Teach a lot of leadership courses and social enterprise courses, those kinds of things. This is a special time for me to be able to introduce one of my dear friends, which I'm very lucky to say, Dr. Paige Haber-Curran. This is the 2024 Gary Laben Lecture. This is funded by engineering alum Gary Laben, and his gift allows us to bring world-class leadership experts to our campus every year, and no exception here. You see the title of the program here, which I'm really excited to learn from Dr. Haber-Curran. Currently, Paige is a professor in the Department of Counseling, Leadership, Adult Ed, and School Psychology at Texas State University. She has a master's in college student personnel from the University of Maryland and a PhD from the University of San Diego. She's also a Fulbright Scholar partner and a Fulbright Scholar. She's has a wonderful partner. She's a terrific mother of two delightful daughters, and again, a dear friend. I got to mention this, Paige, sorry. The mentor has become the mentee in our relationship. Paige interned for me when she was a master's student at the University of Maryland at College Park. And it's wonderful in a long career to have people reach the heights that she has, and for me to be the person who is learning from her. So without any further ado, my friend and colleague.
Wow, world class and wow. I don't know about all that, but I know that I am super excited to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I have a special place in my heart for Hopkins. As Bill mentioned, I did an internship here during my master's program and have been on campus at other points in time as well. And whenever there's big sports tournaments or competitions going on, I'm always rooting for Hopkins. So it's nice to be here today. So I was asked to do a session focused on some of my research around gender and leadership, and so I'm going to do that for you all today. I want to encourage questions. If you have a question regarding what I'm talking about at the time, feel free to raise your hand, or I'm also going to leave some time at the end to allow for questions as well. So a little bit about me, in addition to what Bill shared. I have always been interested in leadership. That's something that I, just from a young age, maybe it was nature versus nurture, I'm not sure, but I'm a firstborn. I have a younger brother. When I started school, I would come home every day after school and I would teach him everything I learned that day in school. So I've always kind of been into education as well. And fast forward, he became a National Merit Scholar, so I'd like to think maybe I had some sort of an impact on him, I'm not sure. But I always enjoyed making a positive difference, particularly in other people. That seemed really interesting to me. Although at the time, I wouldn't have called it leadership, right? And at the time, I was, sometimes we hear about girls being called bossy and trying to reframe that around maybe being assertive or taking on a leadership role or whatever that may be. So I kind of think about some of my upbringing around that, and I always liked to figure out a way that I could help and make an impact. So that was some of my early thinking about that. I really didn't think too much about my identity as a person until I got to college. And part of that is I grew up in a very homogeneous community, a very small town in Colorado. A lot of people came from similar racial background, socioeconomic background. And I went to the University of Arizona, which is a very different environment. And I really started to learn a lot about identity. Starting with my own identity. And at the time, I'll be honest, I wasn't even thinking a whole lot around gender. I was thinking about some of the identities where I've had privilege in my life and learning about that. And that was a pretty impactful experience for me. Now, I had the privilege of not being able to think about some of those things until I was in college. And I know that may not be the case for everyone. When I went to graduate school, down the road, I was about to say up the road, down the road in College Park, I started studying leadership in more of an academic way. And I started to become interested in the topic of gender. And how does gender play a role in leadership? I started to become aware and pay attention of messages around gender in our society and started to see how that impacts the way that people may engage in leadership, take up leadership, or decide not to take up leadership as well. And so I was seeing this not only in myself, but in the students who I worked with. I also at the time had the opportunity to become very good friends with a colleague of mine who was in my master's program, who was very interested in studying gender, particularly around gender and how it intersects with sexuality, and also around toxic views of masculinity and how that is how at the time he ended up doing his dissertation research on masculinity in college men and understanding that. And so we both brought these different lenses, different lived experiences, and have come together to do a lot of interesting research around that. So I want to make sure that you all know that when I'm here to talk about gender and leadership, I'm here to talk about the construct of gender and not just one gender. I think that if we look at historically on how gender has been studied or looked at in our society, any sort of like a gender center has historically been focused on women. That's not where we are today in our society. Gender encompasses individuals from all gender identities. So this isn't a session just for women, and it's certainly not a session for women with privileged identities, like racial identities that might be more privileged, not just for cisgender women. This is a session to talk about gender more broadly, okay? And so I hope you'll engage me in that. I forgot to mention that this was me as a student leader. So this is when I started to think about things at the University of Arizona, and this was a leadership team that I worked with when I was a junior at the University of Arizona, and I really started to view myself and the concept of leadership very differently. All right. So I want to briefly share with you some ideas around some scholarly kind of framework around gender first. Gender is one identity that we have. We have a lot of different identities. This is actually a model developed by faculty members who were at the University of Maryland. They've since retired, but Susan Jones and Mary Lou McEwen did this model looking at multiple dimensions of identity. And so the way we can look at this, let me pull this out of here really quick. Make sure does this do a red? There we go, kind of, yeah. Okay, so if this is identity for an individual, we can see that there's a lot of different things that make up someone's identity. Sexual orientation, gender identity, culture, race, religion, social class. We can add regional identity to the mix. Right now I'm teaching a class this semester in Austria. That's where I did my Fulbright, and I was just out there for spring break. National identity was a big deal there. I have a class of 29 students representing 19 different nationalities around the world. Really incredible, and we've been exploring culture in that class. Really fascinating. Anyway, that's a side note. So if each of these rings here are identity, you can see that they intersect with each other, right? Your gender identity intersects with your racial identity. It intersects with your, I don't see ability on here, but ability status. It intersects with potentially your racial identity, intersects with your religion. So there are different things, that make up our individual being and our individual identities and how they intersect, okay? Sometimes we may not even be aware of them. Sometimes we tend to be a little bit more aware of the identities that may hinder our access to things, that may become challenges in different contexts. And sometimes we aren't quite as aware of the identities that we kind of take for granted or don't have to think about a whole lot. Now, what I really like about this too is this concept of the core. I can get this to work. There we go. The core. So if this is the core sense of yourself, there are going to be some identities that might be more to your core. So I have my identity as a woman is pretty close to my core. I study this. I have 2 daughters. I think a lot about gender. Okay, that may not be the case for everyone in here. Maybe it's your religious identity is really, really more close to your core. Maybe it's your social class identity. Whatever that may be, that can shift and that can change in different contexts. Okay, so for example, when I go back to my college experience, I hadn't really thought a whole lot about identity until I went to college. I think that's a pretty incredible part of the impact of college, is you start to learn about these things if you haven't been exposed to them previously. I started to recognize some of these components and started to figure out what was core to who I am. Okay. Other things that can impact our core of who we are could be our personal attributes, characteristics, our own personal identity and sense of self. And then things can impact this around us, our family background, sociocultural conditions, our experiences, maybe our career planning ideas, right? So this makes up who we are. We are complex, right? And I think that that's pretty cool. Okay. I want to also mention that this also exists then within larger societal systems. So societal systems around kind of the historical context of a society, a culture, political context, economic context. All those things can impact our sense of identity. Okay, so gender. Gender is also complex. So I think it's important, and some of you may already have background in this, but I think it's important to distinguish between these things. Biological sex is different than gender. Okay, biological sex has to do with biology, organs, and our sexual organs, whereas gender is understood to be something that's socially constructed. So what that means is society has created certain expectations around gender and what that means for individuals. So how we make meaning of our gender can be different for each of us, and other people also may make meaning of our gender, whether or not they're doing so in a way that's aligned with how you view yourself. Okay, so I think this genderbread person is an interesting way to look at this, to kind of understand these concepts that oftentimes are smushed together. So we talked about biological sex. Gender identity is how somebody thinks about their own gender. So this is so biological sex would be like female, male, whereas gendered identity might be you identify as a woman or a man or gender non-binary or transgender, right? Wide range. Attraction actually has to do with sexual orientation, not gender. And this could be attraction to individuals broadly. This could be attraction to somebody based on their gender. And then expression is how we outwardly show our gender, right? And so this could be showing things in a way that may be perceived in society as being more masculine or being more feminine or a mix. And many of these things can shift and vary over time or day by day for some individuals, right? So I think it's important for us to understand that there is a difference between gender and sex, okay? And we see that the types of societal expectations that we have from a very, very early on are very prevalent. And I want to do a quick exercise with you, okay, around this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up, I want you to think about messages that you've kind of heard growing up, whether that's from families, school, faith communities, media, around this idea of what does it mean to be a good girl? Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about things. So you may have heard this if you identify as a woman or you received messages early on about a good girl does this, or if you don't identify as being a girl or woman, what you learned about how girls should be growing up. So let me give you an example. We're going to identify some things that can fit in the box. So this fits in within this messaging that we might have heard, like you do this, it means you're a good girl. So it might be polite. Okay, I don't know, I got messages around that, like you have to be polite or kind. Maybe outside of the box that wouldn't be aligned with that might be angry. Like sometimes there's some messaging around not showing anger. Okay, some other might be makeup, right? Maybe, you get dressed up, you look nice, you put makeup on. Maybe something outside of that would be spitting, like girls do not spit, you don't spit. right? Okay, so what I want you to do, just with somebody next to you, I want you to come up with 3 things that could go in the box and 3 things that you might see out of the box. And we'll hear a couple of those in a minute. Okay, so let me preface by saying when I solicit answers from you, we are not going to assume that this is what you believe, but we're talking about messages, right, around this. So this may or may not be, but what you believe. What are some things that you all identified for in the box? A good girl in the box. Let's see, could we get a couple from over on this side? Yes.
Being compliant.
Being compliant. Yeah, following the rules. Yeah. Okay. I see some folks over here going, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. What else? A couple more from this side, and then we'll come over here. In the box, yeah.
You talked about voice.
Voice.
And, like you're not supposed to, but they have a polite, calm, gentle.
Polite, calm, gentle tone and voice. Yeah. Not raising your voice. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Appearance, shirts or skirts, dresses, letting your hair down, doing your hair. Yeah. Good. Okay. Thank you. How about a couple over here for in the box? Yeah.
We talked about like inside the box, not eating too much.
Yeah, not eating too much, watching what you eat. Yeah. Yes. Caring for others. Yeah. Being caring and considerate. Yeah. Clothing. Dresses, skirts. Yeah. Look nice, but like also some messaging around like, but don't show too much of this or whatever that may be. Yeah, so a lot of messaging around appearance and clothing. Okay, how about outside the box? Let's start over here. What are some things that would be like, this does not, oh, good, I see a lot of hands. Yes.
Sitting with your legs wide open.
Sitting with your legs wide open, yeah. Getting your hands dirty, yeah. So wanting to stay clean, yeah.
Talking back.
Talking bad? Yeah, like trash talking somebody kind of? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Did I see your hand too? Getting your hands dirty, yeah.
Doing physical work.
Physical work, yeah.
Having strong opinions on anything.
Having super strong opinions around anything, yeah.
All right, and I don't mean this in a bad way at all, but like doing gross bodily things. Like it is our
Yeah, like farting, burping. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we can talk about farting in here. Yeah. I'm thinking of all these funny things with my 4-year-old daughter. She's always like, Mom, I just farted a whole bunch. I'm like, great, we can talk about that. You are allowed to talk about that, right? I'm challenging some of this in my head where it's like, we're not supposed to talk about that. But I'm like, you know what, we're gonna talk about it. Everybody does this, right? Okay, how about a couple out of the box over here?
What you like play with, like
Yeah.
would be Barbie and
Yeah,
G.I.
G.I. Joe, yeah. Uh-huh.
We talked about not talking back, but in the sense of not being very respectful to your, so you wouldn't ever disrespect an elder.
Yeah, not disrespecting the elder, yeah. Not asserting yourself, potentially, yeah.
We talked about smoking cigarettes,
Oh, yeah.
dating the bad boy.
Yeah. Smoking cigarettes.
All of the things that were
Basically, I described my sister Sharon.
Okay, so Bill described his sister Sharon. And then Peggy's on the inside. So cigarettes, swearing, yeah. And the reason why I'm repeating all this, y'all, is for the recording. We can't record it if you don't have the microphone. So that's why I'm repeating it, so it will be captured. Okay, good. I mean, good. I don't know about good, but interesting, right? But the thing is that a lot of us could probably relate to some of these things we heard, even if we never internalized this, even if we never ourselves expected others along this. These are kind of prevalent messages, right? Okay, let's do the same for this. Real man. So what a real man does, right? So some examples I have here, and you guys, y'all, I live in Texas, so this could be like even amplified in Texas. Okay, tough, right? Man got to be tough. Real man's got to be tough. And you notice the other one said good girl. This says real man. And there's a reason behind that. How many times have you heard people talk about grown women in organizations as girls? Do we hear people talking about grown men as organization as boys? No. Sensitive, right? Sensitive. Kind of socialized around, mention cry, be sensitive, things like that. Again, these are not things that we need to believe, but that we're talking about messages. Beer, whiskey. Whiskey's kind of the new one, right? Well, I don't know if it's new, but nail polish. It's typically not, socialized. I know my brother would want to wear a nail polish, and it was like, boys don't wear nail polish, right? You don't wear that to school because this will happen, right? Okay, let's do it again. 3 for the inside, 3 for the outside. Real man. All right. Hopefully you got a couple for each. Let's start over here again. How about a couple for inside the box, real man? What do we have? Grilling meat. And let me tell you, there's a difference in Texas between grilling and barbecuing. I learned that. Barbecue is barbecue, like brisket, stuff like that. Grilling is hot dogs and hamburgers. So yeah, but that's the man's job, right? Yeah. Get the grill, yeah. Being the breadwinner, making a lot of money. Yeah. Playing or talking sports. Sports is everything. Yeah. Okay, over here. Yes.
Like
Being jacked. Yeah. Tough, man. Okay. Being jacked. What else? Yes.
Like tools.
Tools. Yeah, especially like power tools. Yeah. Talking loudly, taking up a lot of space with that. Yeah.
I think like being able to withstand anything without showing emotion.
Yeah, being able to withstand anything without showing emotion.
Like
Fighting, going to war. Yeah. Okay. Whew, this is heavy stuff, y'all. Okay. Out of the box. Over here. Yeah.
Like showing insecurity.
Showing insecurity, right? Yeah.
Like dainty eating.
Salads, yeah. Quiche, salads, yeah.
You said being like too hygienic.
Too hygienic, yeah, like caring too much about appearance maybe and too hygienic, okay. Crying, yeah. Over here.
We were talking about like stay-at-home dad.
Yeah, like a stay-at-home dad, that role.
Or a real man could be like work with family.
Yeah, so prioritizing family over work as opposed to work over family. Yeah, so we can see that also relating to some of the inside the box when we talk about breadwinner. Yeah. Gender chores. Okay. Yeah. Taking out the trash, not doing dishes. Yeah. Yeah, playing like the flute or something, and like dance or something, ballet, something like that, gymnastics. Okay. So, what do y'all feel about this? I think it's super limiting that these are the messages that we hear. Super limiting, because this doesn't describe me, the other one, right? If I identify as a woman, right? It adds these expectations that are socially constructed, right? Absolutely, there are plenty of people who might identify as men that really want to order a fruity cocktail and don't want to have the beer, right? And there are plenty of men who have incredible emotions that can have a lot of power in showing those emotions, right? And it's very, very limiting, right? And it creates these very challenging messages in our society about who we need to be based on what society says we need to be. And it involves a lot of challenges for individuals. It also can really limit individuals' potentials to impact an organization or impact society, right? I see this in raising 2 girls right now, and whenever they interact with people kind of in the public, the comments, the questions are always around appearance. If they're they're pretty, they like their dress, they like their hair. Of course, they're beautiful kids, right? I'm a little biased. But how about, what are the things they're interested in? What gets them excited at school? What sports are they playing? Right? When it becomes so focused on these gendered expectations of who somebody should be based on society's messages, it can be very, very limiting, right? And so this is where I base a lot of my research and study on gender and leadership, because what we see is that this translates to a leadership lens as well. Okay, this is kind of the gendered stereotypes that we might see. Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about social construction of gender, but I do want to say that there are repercussions when we act outside of those boxes, right? If something outside of the box for a woman is assertive or angry, and a woman acts assertive or angry, what happens? What does she get labeled? The B word, right? And so we receive punishments or rewards based on whether or not we act within these societal norms on gender, right? Now, I also only did this on 2 genders, right? I did man and woman, girl and man, right? There are other genders that exist, right? And there's certainly messages around folks that may not identify in the gender binary, right? And there's Judith Butler's a scholar looking at gender, and she talks about how we are all performing gender. Like, gender is a performance, right? And we're either meeting or not meeting the societal expectations of gender in our lives. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I mentioned that this also then relates to leadership. We have created gendered expectations around leadership too. So what I have is I have a couple different things in here. So we see leadership frameworks that might say autocratic is one way of leading and democratic's on the other end. Okay, somebody who's very task-oriented versus relationship-oriented. Transactional leadership, transformational. Some of these might resonate with you if you've had some leadership courses. Being very competitive versus collaborative. Being agentic, acting with agency, or being more communal. Okay, and what's happened in the leadership literature is that this, on the left, has been tagged as masculine leadership, and this has been tasked and assigned feminine leadership. What do y'all think about that? Anybody have any thoughts? Man, I think that's limiting, right? Just like with the other. I'll tell you what, there are times when I might be very communal and very democratic, and there are times when I know I need to be assertive. I need to put my foot down, right? When I need to act with agency, because the environment calls for that. And if we notice too, these are on a continuum. We do not live in a world of binaries, although society wants to make us believe that we do. right? Because it makes it easier for our brains to say, where does that person fall? Are they more like this or more like this? We see that with gender. Are they a man or a woman? Who are they? What are they? Right? But the reality is that these can exist on a continuum. Same with leadership. And we all, regardless of our gender, have the ability to engage in any of these types of leadership behaviors. And I've struggled with this movement of, oh, well, this is a more feminist or feminine way of leading, right? Now, research shows that these types of leading on the right-hand side are actually really, really good for organizations, really valuable. And knowing that, why are we going to say then, well, this is how men lead? It's not how men lead. That's also how some women lead. That's how some people of all genders lead that way, right? But I know a lot of people who lead over here, right? My colleague, Dan, who I was telling you about, he and I did a research study. I did this study first looking at college women, and actually I'll move over to that right now because that's what I'm going to talk about next. And I looked at college women who held leadership roles in student organizations on a college campus. And I'll tell you about some of those findings here in a second. And Dan and I, he was studying masculinity, he was particularly studying masculinity within gay men studying in college. And we did a study looking at college men who held leadership roles in organizations and their leadership approach. And there were more similarities between the men in this study than the women than there were differences. Okay? So I think that our society wants us to believe that there are these huge extreme differences. I think the differences are what society expects of us. That's where the differences are, not necessarily how we engage. We all have the capacity to engage in a lot of different leadership approaches. And I'll tell you what, for these ones, there is time and place to take on these types of leadership approaches. But if we rely too much on those, it's not really that great, especially for women, because this is what society expects, right? But we should all be able to engage in task-oriented leadership behavior when it's needed, and engage in relationship-oriented leadership behavior when it's needed. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about some of my research. So I started off studying, when I was down at the University of Maryland, I started off studying leadership, and it was a big national data set, and I looked at gender differences in leadership, and I thought that was really interesting. And a lot of the research that was being done at the time was around comparing, at the time it was really just looking at men and women as the only genders, comparing men and women around leadership. And the same findings kept on coming up in my research and in other people's research. And that was that women engage in more collaborative approaches to leadership than men, although the effect size was very, very small. Men have more confidence in their ability to lead than women, okay, or efficacy, if you've heard that term before, around leadership, self-efficacy for leadership. Okay, and I kind of got to the point where I was like, okay, so we have established that. I think we've done enough of those studies, and now we need to dig deeper, because comparison studies only tell us so much. What are we going to do with that, right? So this is when I started to really kind of try to understand gender more as a construct in terms of gender identity. What is one's gender identity? What role does that play in their leadership? Not just, are there differences in people by gender? Okay, so I started looking at studying college women who held formal leadership roles in student organizations and really tried to understand their experience and the role of gender in that. So let me tell you a little bit of what I found in that study. I found that the women felt a sense of responsibility to the organization and its members, a very strong sense of responsibility. They felt a responsibility to empower organizational members. They experienced successes in enhancing the organization, leaving it in a better place than they found it, and developing group members. Okay? They experienced challenges balancing task and relationship behaviors. So these expectations, if they were too task-oriented or too assertive, then they weren't meeting those gendered expectations, right? They also experienced challenges balancing the role of leader and friend. If any of you have ever moved into a leadership role in an organization with a bunch of people who you were a member with, it can be hard, right? Because all of a sudden you have to take on that role of leader. And they also found some challenges in the organizational and environmental context. Let me give you an example. There was a woman who I interviewed who was president of her sorority. And she really wanted to be more collaborative, but she said the way that we have to run our meetings is very formulaic and very hierarchical. She said, I'm actually up on a stage in front of everybody and I have a gavel and everybody else has to sit down there. That's already setting up a dynamic of who I am as a leader. And she was having a hard time with some of those kind of formality. I'm not in a Greek organization, so I don't know all the formal terms, but I think, student government, somebody in student government was experiencing the same thing, right? So sometimes it's the organizational structures that provide challenges as well. Okay, I mentioned my colleague and I then did this similar study around men, and one of the things that they felt was that they felt these gendered messages around needing to lead in a certain way, and that that felt restricting to them. Because one of the things they were learning when they were taking leadership classes was around more communal approaches to leadership, yet they struggled with enacting that sometimes in situations. Okay. I work at Texas State University. It's a Hispanic serving institution. I have worked and lived in Arizona and California and Texas. And I've worked with a number of students who identify as Latinx. And I was really interested in what is the student leadership experience of individuals at a Hispanic serving institution, particularly those who identify as Latinx. So I did a study looking at both men and women. I really did. That happens to be who I interviewed. I didn't necessarily go about trying to choose people from specific genders. But one of the things that I found in the study when I looked specifically at women was I used a framework, Yoso's theory on, let me make sure I have that right, on model of community cultural wealth. So this has to do with an asset-based approach to looking at, most of the time, race in regard to whatever construct you're looking at. So in this case, leadership. So rather than saying, here's where the deficits are, it was looking at here are where the assets are, and found that these women in the study that I did identified significant social capital in the relationships they built, familial capital, had a lot of family some challenges, particularly for students who are first generation to college, but strong relationships with family, that was super important. Aspirational capital in terms of goals that they had and aspirations, and then navigational capital, having to navigate systems that weren't necessarily built for them. Right? And so that was another interesting study. So I spent some time doing research looking at groups of students and really trying to also not just focus on women who look like me, which was what a lot of the research on gender and leadership had focused on previously, either didn't even consider race or mostly just looked at white women. There's been incredible, amazing scholars doing this work, looking at other communities. And I think that that's super important. And not just looking at women, looking at folks of all gender backgrounds. Okay, one more study I want to share with you, because this is near and dear to my heart as well, is I co-authored this book with a colleague, or two colleagues, on emotionally intelligent leadership. So another way that I tried to explore gender a little bit more deeply, rather than just looking at comparative studies, is we looked at college women who had strong emotional intelligence according to this model. Okay, emotionally intelligent leadership. So they had based on their this was a quantitative study, based on their scores, they would be considered higher. And we compared those women who had the higher scores on emotional intelligence with those who had lower, to see what are the competencies these folks that had higher scores, what did they have that the folks with lower scores didn't have? So that we can use these findings to develop leadership programs, to say, and we looked at it specifically around confidence in leadership self-efficacy, which is known to be quite low in an area for growth for women. This is what we found. These 4 areas: women who had a stronger sense of initiative, more capacity around facilitating change, developing relationships and managing conflict, had higher confidence in their ability to lead. What can we say by looking at this list that I have here? Anything interesting about those? Interestingly, particularly managing conflict and initiative tended to be ones that, when we did do comparison studies, that men tended to be higher in. So interestingly, it were some of these strengths that come from what some may look at as a more masculine way of leading that these women were adopting. So if we think about that, it's recognizing that we can be enacting all sorts of leadership behaviors regardless of our gender, right? And that those can be very, very valuable. Okay. So then I got to this point where I said, okay, I've kind of studied these groups of people. That's really fun. I enjoy doing that. And around the time I got tenure at my university, and so some of the pressure to publish empirical research articles some of that steam came out. I didn't have to do that as much anymore. And I thought, what impact do I want to make on this field? And I went into this field of leadership studies because I want to make an impact on the professionals who are doing the work. I want to make an impact on educators, teaching leadership, facilitating leadership so that they can make an impact on students. Okay, this is what I care about. And so I said, these studies are great, and you could read it and you can find some pieces, but I want to translate kind of this world of leadership and gender. I want to pull those things together and try to impact practice and help give practitioner-oriented pieces that people could actually use. Okay, so that's where I've kind of shifted some of my work, and I want to share with you a little bit of that. So that was my shift in scholarly focus, right? And my gosh, the time flies. So I'm going to pick a couple of these, and then we'll see. Actually, let me pause right now and see if there are any questions. Okay, so I might go more than, I might go into the questions section a little bit time. Okay, so that shift in scholarly focus. So this, my friend who I mentioned earlier, Dan and I, we published this in 2017. It's a special issue of this journal, essentially, and we were editors for it. And what we really tried to do in this piece is critique the research on gender and leadership, some of which I've shared with you today. Researching gender leadership is not just about researching women. Now, I happen to share with you a number of my studies that focused on women, right? And there are a lot of other studies that don't. But historically, that was the focus. We really pushed for using intersectionality as a lens for understanding and studying leadership. So that has to do with multiple identities, like that diagram I showed earlier, but also understanding the larger systems that affect those identities, the systems of privilege and oppression that impact our opportunities, our ability to enact change, and so forth, and how those are interconnected. Focusing on gender and leadership and not just comparisons. Challenging those limited constructions of gender. Emphasizing not just leadership roles, but identity, development, and growth. And then shifting the mental models of what leadership is and what it can look like. So I want to zoom in really quick. One of the chapters, we had two authors write. They wrote a chapter on looking at leadership development for trans-identified individuals. And they found that the leadership experiences that many folks who identified as trans engaged in was around grassroots leadership. And it was community-based leadership typically. Not the traditional, I'm a president of a student organization on campus, right? Or I am on an athletic team and this is what my role is. There's a lot, so kind of a lot around activism. And so really kind of reframing, where does leadership take place? And it doesn't just take place in what maybe our society has deemed as the traditional settings for leadership. Okay, so that was one of the pieces that we did. Okay, another piece we did, I did this also with Dan. We love writing together because I think we make our thinking better. Find a person like that. This was for educators, but this translates to anyone really, is the importance of all of us to challenge and unlearn the messages we've learned and heard about gender and leadership, right? So this is the mom, I farted 3 times thing I shared with you earlier. Challenging and unlearning the message that I have in my head that girls aren't supposed to talk about that. because that still pops up, right? So it's about doing our own work to challenge and unlearn the things that we learn about leadership. We've learned a lot that leadership, societal messages that you see is about taking charge, being in control. That's one form of leadership. It's not the most effective form of leadership in most such situations. How do I unlearn those messages, right? How do I unlearn the message that women are supposed to be nice and cordial in an organization? Because you know what? Sometimes it's really important for people, including women, to be angry, because sometimes there's things to be angry about, and time and place, right? So challenging and unlearning that, promoting a wide range of leadership capacities, right? So what I mean by that is that we all, like I said, we all have the ability to enact leadership in a lot of different ways, right? So how do we promote that in individuals and help people know that? My 7-year-old's already getting messages about how she's being bossy at school. Now, let me tell you, she is being bossy at school. I know that, right? She's kind of a little mini-me. But how do I work with that around harnessing that and also helping her think about, how are you listening? What do you think other people want in this group? Have you thought about that? A funny story about how she started an origami club at her school. Let me just tell you the 3 things. She created an origami club at her school, 7 years old. She created 3 rules for her sign-up sheet when people signed up. Number 1, don't talk over me. Number 2, don't be bossy. Number 3, we all work on the same thing. Who do you think she wants to have in charge of that? She is in charge, right? So that's been fun. It's been fun working with her on that, right? But how do I foster that, even though it's a little bit like, okay, how do I foster that rather than squash that? Because if I start telling her, you need to be nice and you need to do all this stuff, I mean, yes, she should be nice. We all should be nice, right? But how do I foster that? So, because the highest point in time of girls' confidence in their life is 8 years old. At that point, it starts to dip, right? So these are the types of things I'm thinking about. And then acknowledging individuals' multiple and interlocking identities. Recognize, and that should actually be a stronger word than acknowledging. That should be embracing, I think. Embracing individuals' multiple and interlocking identities. To know that my identity is going to be different than someone else's identity. Even if we might look similar or share, a gendered identity, my experience as a white woman may be very, very different than a woman who comes from a different racial or ethnic background, right? Okay, so that's some of the stuff I've been working on, and I want to just share one last piece. Is I've also started to think about what are the ways that we make meaning in our research, and how can we learn about gender and leadership in other less traditional research ways. And so I had the opportunity to work with some amazing women on, we engaged in something called collaborative autoethnography. So we all were looking at leader identity, and we looked at that and doing some exploration of how we grew up and messages we heard around gender and leadership, and we actually created these things called leadergrams based on some collaborative autoethnographic frameworks, where we actually mapped some of our own messages. The font of this went very weird, where we mapped some of the messages and made meaning out of that experience. And then also looking at counter narratives on gender and leadership. So this book just came out this year and looks at women, both cisgender women and women who do not identify as cisgender, looking at their leadership narratives and how they make meaning of leadership and really elevating their stories. It's called counter narratives, and bringing in differing, less dominant perspectives, maybe voices that traditionally have not been elevated to the conversation. And so that was a really incredible experience, being able to work with the women in that study and the other authors as well. All right. So since I mentioned them, I want to just briefly tell you why I'm doing this work. And I'm doing it for these these kids, right? These are both of my sets of kids, right? So these are my daughters over here, but then these are the students who I work with, the master's students, and incredible individuals, but they're going to be the ones going out and working on college campuses doing this type of work. And so I see a sense of responsibility of how do I help people think differently about this? Because the way we've been thinking about this for a long time is incredibly limiting to individuals, to organizations, and to our society. Right? And you all play a role in that now too. I mean, you already did, but now I'm tapping you to do the same, right? To challenge those expectations that you're hearing about yourself and that you may inadvertently or unknowingly be putting on others. All right. That flew by, at least for me. But what questions, if any, do you all have that might be lingering? We have an extra microphone too that we can pass around if that's helpful. Okay, if you all don't have questions, I'm going to say something really quick. There was a slide that we didn't have a chance to get to that was around looking at feminist leadership, and this is feminism has become for many has become a bad word, or still is, I don't know. But this is around eliminating oppression based on gender and sex. Okay? Who wouldn't want that, right? And let me tell you, one of the people who I look to as one of the best examples of feminist leadership is in this room, and that's Bill. And I will just say that. He was my mentor, he was my supervisor, is my mentor around that, and he brings a lens that I have learned so much about around gender, right? And is an incredible model for that. And I just want to say all of us can engage in this work, right? And I would say we all have a responsibility to do so too. So, any questions at all? Yeah.
I have a question about the, thanks.
MCs are MC.
So as when you had the slide that showed kind of the ways of looking at things from a masculine perspective and a feminist or a women's perspective.
Let me pull that up. Yep.
So I've intellectually gotten to the place where I'm all in, right? Democratic, relationship-oriented. Not only that, the studies that I've done show that leadership is more effective. The end results are even fiscally are better served using those ways of leading. How do men unlearn how we've been brought up in a way to think that's the way to lead when we know intellectually that's more effective? I'm wondering what you think about what men need to do to unlearn that.
Ooh. Okay. Well, that's a really good question. I think we can do this in different ways, right? So I think, first of all, I think we should be modeling it. So I think the way that we, for anybody that is going to has some sort of impact on others, particularly of a younger generation, whether that's a nephew, a son, whatever it may be. How are we modeling that? How are we making sure that people know it's important to be able to see emotion? Because a lot of this has to do with emotion, right? Like masking up emotion. But I think that the ways that we can do this is to ask questions and listen. So to know if we can shift our mindset that because what happens on the left-hand side is this puts the leader in charge and the leader has all the answers. That's just simply not the case.
But it can be pretty intoxicating, can't it?
Yeah. Because when you start to move over here, you lose a little bit of control.
Right.
And there's fear that can come with that. There's also immense opportunity. And I think that using the balance, so I don't think the goal is ever to be over here all the time. You're going to get walked over. There are times when I need to be really assertive in situations, right? Especially when I'm not taken seriously in situations because I'm a woman or I look young or whatever it may be, right? And there's times when I'm like, I'm going to use my power that I have because this is the time and place to do it. But I think it's getting to a point, and maybe it's not let me just open it up for everything and we're going to do everything collaboratively, but asking questions and listening, that pulls people in, makes them feel like they have a voice, right? And by doing that, it shifts our perspective because we don't have all the answers. I don't know if that helps. But yeah, I think a lot of it is for us to do some of that metacognition of thinking about our thinking. When we're in a situation, do we think about, why am I thinking this way? Is this because this is what's been modeled to me? Is this because this is what society says I need to do? A lot of times we also learn, for good and for bad, from what other leaders do. And I think if we can think about the leaders who we've worked for, whether that's a coach or a teacher or a supervisor or whatever that may be, what if it was a really good one, what are the things that they did? And how can we replicate it? If it's really bad one, how do we make sure we don't redo that? Right? Yeah. Yeah. Good question. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your Thursday afternoon to come to this beautiful space and be here and explore this topic. I hope it'll help you kind of think about things in a little bit of different ways in the multiple roles that you have in your lives. And yeah, thank you.